Jane Velez-Mitchell, Jane Unchained, and we are very honored and delighted to have Dr. Milton Mills with us. And we've got a panel that we're joining in progress. We also are going to have other guests who are coming on to have a conversation about what's happening today in America, the uprising, the protests, and how it intersects with our movement, the vegan movement. And I know you've spoken eloquently, Dr. Mills, about dietary racism. I think a lot of people have no idea what that means and why you believe the USDA guidelines are indeed racist and hurting children of color. Can you elaborate on that, sir?
Well, sure. I mean, there are a number of ways in which racist recommendations have been sort of incorporated into the U.S. Dietary Guidelines, and that includes most prominently the recommendation to consume dairy products, because there is absolutely no physiologic or health need for human beings to consume the mammary secretions of another species ever at all. And the touted reason for people to consume dairy products is allegedly for the calcium content, but the USDA, US government, and all health authorities have known for well over 100 years that dairy calcium does not help build strong bones. It doesn't prevent osteoporosis. And in fact, all of the research shows that the more dairy a country consumes per capita, the higher their rates of osteoporosis and the higher the risk of hip fracture. Moreover, more recent studies have also shown very, very strong association between consumption of dairy products and increased incidence of breast cancer, prostate cancer, and other hormone-related cancers in men and women. And then when you review the data on the prevalence of lactose intolerance in various ethnic groups, it becomes instantly clear that if people of color are encouraged to eat dairy products, they are going to have health problems, because the prevalence of lactose intolerance is so high amongst ethnic groups. So, for instance, whereas we find that within white European populations, in the United States, the prevalence of lactose intolerance averages about 30 to 33%. When you look at Asian Americans, it's 95%, and African Americans, it's 75%, and Native Americans, it's 74%, and in Hispanic Americans, it is up to 53%. And what's really interesting is that if you compare African Americans, say, to Africans in West Africa, which is where the gene pool for African Americans came from, that's where the slaves were taken, the prevalence of lactose intolerance in West Africa actually approaches 95% or more. And the only reason it's less here is because of all the raping of Black women that was done during slavery. And so you have the penetrance of white European genes within the African American gene pool that lessens the prevalence somewhat. And it's a similar thing with Hispanic Americans, because of the mixing of Spanish genetic material into the native populations. There is a diminution of the prevalence of lactose intolerance that would otherwise be much higher, because dairy products were not part of the traditional cuisines of these groups.
Let me bring in Cynthia King. Cynthia, you are a leader in the vegan people of color movement in New York. You have a school, Cynthia King Dance, and I've known you since I pretty much met you at a protest outside the Staples Center in Brooklyn. 9-degree weather, you brought your entire school to demonstrate against Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey Circus. I think a lot of people are trying to find how our movements intersect. And Dr. Mills spoke just now about dietary racism, that we are forcing people who are allergic to dairy to eat it, and that's making them sick and in cases killing them in a lot of cases. What are your thoughts in this moment of crisis in the nation where there is a national uprising about how our two movements intersect, Cynthia?
Hi, Jane. Thanks, and I'm sorry I'm late due to some technical issues, but and I missed the beginning of the.
All right, go for it.
But well, and thank you for talking about this subject too, and I'm honored to be with these other experts in the field. But I wanted to just jump to an action, to be able to take action, if that's okay, to let people know that there's something that they can do, because I assume we've talked about the intersection already, that there is something that can be done. First of all, Dr. Mills is on our advisory board. I'm a board member of the Coalition for Healthy School Food. And our mission is bringing plant-based foods into schools, and primarily Black and brown students are benefiting from our action. But there's something that everyone can do right now, and that is there's 5 days left to comment on the US Dietary Guidelines. If they go to healthyschoolfood.org, they can click on the link to learn about the impact of those guidelines on people of color, and they can submit comments. Dr. Mills and our executive director, Amy Hamlin, testified last summer on this subject, and pointing to the racism in the policy, that it is a racist policy to have to serve 3 or more servings of dairy in the school system. So I don't know if I answered your question or jumped right ahead, but I would love to make sure that we have an action item for people who are listening, so that there is something to do.
Yes, and I believe, if I can play this, we have Dr. Mills talk before the USDA Advisory Committee. Check this out.
Of Gilead Medical Group. I have no relationship whatsoever to the pharmaceutical company. I work as an internal medicine and critical care physician in the DC metro area, and so I practice both outpatient and hospital-based medicine. I actually came here this morning to call out the racism that is inherent in the U.S. Dietary Guidelines, but then as I got to look at this committee, I suddenly understood why it's such an intractable problem. This committee bears no relationship to the general makeup of the American populace, and whoever put it together is clearly still practicing the optics of tokenism. Now, that is not a attack on any of you as individuals, because I'm sure you're all very accomplished and very...
I don't know if we're able to see it, but anyway, it was a brilliant speech. Screen share is supposed to work with StreamYard, but I guess it doesn't. Very brilliant speech, Dr. Mills, where you spoke about, you said that basically looking at the USDA Advisory Committee, it was completely bereft of people of color.
It was, and that actually was a shock to me. There was one African-American man, as I recall, and he sat there looking like the proverbial duck out of water. I actually was not prepared for that, because I thought that the committee would at least attempt to reflect the U.S. population, but there really wasn't any attempt to do that. And I guess they figured, well, we'll put this one Black person on, and that satisfies our requirements for diversity. But again, it's that kind of thinking that perpetuates this kind of insensitivity to the issues and needs of people of color that we see and have seen for so long with these guidelines and other policies coming out of the federal government.
Well, I mean, this is an opportunity for all of us to sort of change the system. And I know I've read in numerous reports, I don't have the stats, but that African Americans are the fastest growing segment of the vegan community. Cynthia King, and we'll get to you in a second, Lisa, but Cynthia King, you are in the middle of the vegan community in Brooklyn, and I know you've turned so many of your dance students vegan, and your family, your sons are vegan, and there is that connection between veganism, the African American community, as well as the work to end things like dietary racism, environmental racism. We always point out there are no slaughterhouses or concentrated animal feeding operations on Park Avenue or in Beverly Hills. They are put primarily in communities of color, and that is another form of racism.
Oh, absolutely.
This is an opportunity, this national uprising, for us to look at all these injustices and address them. Is it not, Cynthia?
Yes, absolutely. And, I work with young children as young as 3. And, we express our commitment through the arts, and I'm committed to that. And we are all committed to each other for that. And, the fact that we've introduced, I have a vegan studio, and, I teach from the very beginning that they need to keep their entire selves healthy and strong. And especially now, I teach kids and adults. It's like, if you ever needed to be strong and healthy, this is the time. We need you all. We need everyone to be as healthy and strong as possible. So, this is the time. If you were ever toying with the idea before, I can't think of any reason. You probably can't come up with a reason to not rid your life of the meat and dairy industry once and for all. If it wasn't for health reasons, do it for racial justice reasons.
But can you elaborate a little bit on that? Because I think that there's a feeling, and I can totally understand it, that, hey, we're in a national uprising. We're fighting against people being killed on the street, murdered on the street. That's irrelevant right now. But if we look at how people are killed across the course of the day by being fed food that is killing them, that is another form of oppression. And I would like to have both of your reactions to that. Let's go back to Dr. Mills.
Well, there's no question that the fact that unhealthy foods are foisted onto communities of color, and as you said, not only won't you find the CAFOs and other factory farms in the affluent neighborhoods, but they are targeted to communities of color. The same thing is true of fast food outlets. These chains are, again, placed within low-income communities. So you might not find a supermarket that has fresh produce and healthier food options, but you'll find all of the Burger Kings, Wendy's, Popeyes, and so forth that you can name there. And I don't know how political we're allowed to be.
You can say whatever you want.
Well, it turns out that Burger King, McDonald's, Wendy's, Taco Bell, all of these major franchises have given hundreds of thousands of dollars to Trump's re-election campaign.
Well, let me say this, just for legal reasons. I can't independently verify that, and I'm not saying you're wrong, Dr. Mills, and I invite all those companies on anytime. I understand what you're saying, and I get the point, but I don't have any stats in front of me.
I got you, and I firmly understand that, and I would love it if these companies would come on and prove that they didn't do this, because this is yet another form of propping up the hierarchy, the patriarchy, and the power structure that continues to systematically to use the sort of current example, put their feet and knees on the necks of people of color. And by essentially causing us to have access only to the kinds of foods that create disease, not only do they cause us to have a higher death rate, but it also primes us to be victims of things like COVID-19 and other illnesses that might sweep through the country, because we are less capable of fighting off these illnesses because of a very poor and limited diet.
Well, I think those are all excellent points. And in crisis, there is opportunity. Lisa Karlan, what would you like to ask the panel?
Well, I'd like to make a statement, and that is with respect to the United States Dietary Guidelines, because now we had so many people from Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine, from Switch for Good, Dr. Mills included, testifying before the Dietary Guidelines Committee. And the question that I'd like the audience to think about is, why is that important? Why are we pushing to try to get dairy as a food group removed from the dietary guidelines? And it is because those guidelines dictate how the federal government spends money, how they fund schools, how they fund the military, how they fund the VA, Veterans Administration hospitals. Anywhere that the federal government spends money on food, that food has to meet the dietary guidelines. And the irony is that we have a guideline requiring dairy products in schools for breakfast and for lunch to populations of kids who can't handle this, that they lack the enzyme to process it. So it makes them sick. And kids come in that are on the school breakfast program, they get breakfast with milk, they drink it. For the next few hours, they have stomach problems, they have diarrhea, they can't focus and concentrate. By the time they begin to feel better, it's lunchtime and we hit them again with another dose of milk. And this is one of the most important reasons why we need to remove dairy products from the dietary guidelines. So I want to congratulate Dr. Mills on having the integrity to really call it out like it is. When you said this is institutionalized racism, you were speaking 100% the truth. So this is why I'd like to encourage every single person that hears this, please share this video, but also please comment on the United States Dietary Guidelines page. We will post it in our comment section, so that on June 17th, they're going to have a meeting and they're going to discuss this. We want it on the agenda, and we just found out that because
I want to keep moving because we're time constrained. Cynthia King, we had tried to get Omowale Adewale, founder of Black VegFest, on. He appeared for a moment, but he has a statement. Can you read the statement?
Yeah, he's having Wi-Fi issues, and I have a text from him to remind people. He has written 7 points of allyship for white people to read and join on. And you can go to blackvegfest.org to support the organization directly. He's a true leader in our city and beyond. And he's the founder of Black VegFest and many other things. So I would encourage everybody to check out blackvegfest.org and support any way you can and learn about the work that he and his crew are doing and have been doing for many, many years.
And we will have him on one-on-one where he can talk at his leisure when the Wi-Fi is fixed. Now, let me ask you this. You know, again, I want to get back to the relevance. There is a national uprising, and people might say, well, this isn't really relevant right now. But I argue that it is. It is an opportunity in crisis to look at institutionalized racism from every angle. And I see a tremendous commonality between the vegan movement and the animal rights movement, in that slaughterhouse workers, who are almost 100% people of color, many of them immigrants from 30 countries, Latin America, but all over. Because I know this because I interviewed a union leader who said 30 languages are spoken in one slaughterhouse alone. Overwhelmingly, people of color are being forced into slaughterhouses that are riddled with COVID-19. The Trump administration has declared that these are a critical infrastructure under the Defense Protection Act, and they have no legal recourse. It robs them of any legal recourse to say, no, I don't feel like I want to go in. It's a health threat. And so is that not another example of institutionalized racism connected to the food system, Cynthia?
Well, absolutely, Jane. Of course, my dance studio is surrounded by 7 fast food establishments. We have to bring in our own fresh food for snacks for the children. But I just totally agree with you. It's and it's actionable. That's why this is just so important, because we can change. We can make this statement. We can certainly go on. We have 5 days left to make our comments about the dietary guidelines and the racism inherent in it. And I just encourage everybody to do that at least, the very least. I work with children, and I see. I mean, some simple things like we're dancing, and who's feeling constipated? Like, I could see it in them that they're not being given the same opportunities as children from white neighborhoods that have better access to all kinds of things for their health. But I see them moving differently. I see it affecting our children, and it's really, it's the daily importance. It's important in our day, in our everyday life. Whether we're going out to the street tonight to demonstrate or not, this is something that is important from 24 hours a day. I agree with you totally.
Dr. Mills, how can we use this moment of crisis to have a breakthrough to improve the health of people of color around the nation and the world? The most important way, one of the most, taking to the streets and protesting is a great way. I've been to many, many protests, but also using your consumer dollars. The African-American community, minority community across the country has enormous power in the dollar, what they spend it on. Is this a moment to call for action and say, take your power back when it comes to the food system?
Well, there's no question that that's true. And it's incredibly important for people to understand the link between poverty and health, and poverty and racism. And historically, one of the primary means of controlling communities of color was through controlling their food and their food access. And I mean, this was most egregiously demonstrated in the way the U.S. dealt with Native Americans by coming in, destroying, burning their crops, destroying their ability to support themselves, then forcing them onto so-called reservations, which were deliberately chosen to be areas of marginal land where the people imprisoned almost on the reservations were then forced to be dependent on the government for food handouts. But then when the government hands you food or only allows you access to food that keeps you ill, that then keeps you in a position of subservience. And it causes you to end up spending all of your family's resources on health, trying to access healthcare, trying to take care of sick people. So you don't have money to move to a better neighborhood or try to get your kids into better schools or to, combat, say, housing discrimination, because you've got to buy diabetic supplies or whatever, because somebody in the house is always ill. And so that is definitely a means of control, of keeping people sick, keeping them ill, keeping them dying early. And yes, we absolutely need to step out of that access, take back control of our health by switching to a more plant-based dietary pattern, which will help cure and prevent most of the chronic diseases we see.
Well, Dr. Mills, that is a brilliant call to action. So many times in our movement, people say, but not now. That's nice, but not now. It's not the time. I would say now is the time. If you want to take the power back, there's something every day, 3 times a day that we can do to take the power back from the industries that are funding the oppression of people, of communities of color.
Sure.
And I don't see that many people get the connection, but you have expressed it eloquently. So let me ask you, and I'll ask Cynthia as well, what is your call to action, Dr. Milton Mills?
Well, first of all, I agree with you. There's a passage from the Bible that says, today, if you hear his voice, harden not your heart. And that means when you hear something that you know to be true, that's the time to act on it, not later, not when you think it's more convenient, but when you understand it needs to be done. And given that, we need to get off this death train. And that death train is the train that is filled with processed foods, dairy products, meat, and sugar. We need to get back to a whole food, plant-based diet that will help cure, reverse, prevent diabetes. It can help cure, reverse, prevent heart disease. And I have a lecture on YouTube called Diet and Cancer that shows that if you're really willing to make very aggressive dietary changes, plant-based diets have been shown over and over again to actually cure late-stage cancer. So that is the recipe, and my prescription for health is a whole food plant-based diet. Ditch the dairy, get rid of the dead animals, because if you make your body a graveyard, you're going to end up in a graveyard.
I'm part of a coalition that is getting ready to start a whole campaign to boycott meat in solidarity of the slaughterhouse workers, who are also dying. More than 60, and I haven't even kept up. I've died from COVID-19 by being forced into the slaughterhouses.
Those are just the ones we know. Okay? I said those are just the ones we know, because we're not even getting full information on that. Yes.
Yeah. Now, Cynthia, I want to ask you a provocative question. I think that, first of all, we're all brainwashed. One of the reasons why we're seeing the vegan movement rise, and that African Americans are one of the leading groups, if not the leading group, in the rise of veganism right now, is that younger people are not sitting around watching advertiser-based television. If you watch advertiser-based television, you don't hear all this talk. You don't hear anything about dietary racism, environmental racism, the racism inherent in the USDA guidelines. Why? Look at the commercials: meat, dairy, and pharmaceuticals. Honestly, I can't even sit down and watch a newscast if I'm having dinner, because it's disgusting. Every commercial is about somebody having constipation or erectile dysfunction. It's some horrific thing. And yet sometimes people, because of the conditioning that people have gotten through television, feel that they're defending their lifestyle. If you look at, for example, I'm Puerto Rican and Irish. Okay. So if I look at my mother's, who was born in Vieques, Puerto Rico, many of her foods were naturally vegan: yuca, black beans, rice, plátanos, just for 4 examples. If you look at Ethiopian cuisine, you will see it's almost entirely plant-based. In fact, here in Los Angeles, Little Ethiopia has some of the best vegan restaurants. Is there a need to tell people, you're defending the diet that's oppressing you? Go back to your personal history and your ancestry and see what the real diet is. You'll discover it's plant-based.
Well, you said it all, Jane. I just want to say, I live with young people, and it is important to follow the voices in, the social media influence can be greater. They're not watching television. They're not seeing those commercials, thank goodness. But follow Dr. Mills and follow Black VegFest and listen to those messages that are constantly reinforcing why it's important to act. And, like you said, 3 times a day, breakfast, lunch, dinner. Of course, I snack in between more than those 3 times, but we need to get that message to younger people. And I think, my children have had more success than I have, I believe, in convincing, getting the message out to young activists that how they eat and who they support is a very important part of that, of their mission, of their lives, and that they can make those changes every day.
So Lisa, I know you want to jump in. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, what I wanted to say is Dr. Mills was an incredible film called The Invisible Vegan that was done by Jasmine, a young Black woman. Her name, Jasmine Leyva, and you can watch it for free in chapters on YouTube. Dr. Mills, can you tell us a little bit about the culture behind that film that you were in? Because I think coming from you, it means more, because I only learn about it as a white woman, but I have to tell you, I learned so much from watching that film that it really has added color and texture to the fabric of my life. Dr. Mills, tell us about that film.
Well, I mean, what I can tell you is a little bit about the provenance of the film. And that is that the reason Jasmine decided to do the film was because she kept running into this thought pattern that veganism was a white thing and that it was something foreign to the Black community. And she wanted to let people understand that, in fact, there was a long history of being plant-based / vegan within the African-American community and within the African tradition. And that we needed to understand that so that we would understand that we're not, that by becoming vegan or plant-based, we weren't doing something new, but we were actually getting back to our true roots. But let me add something that's really else that's really, really important. Because last January, this was 2019, I was invited down to Alabama to do a program with a woman by the name of Donna Green Goodman and her husband, Eddie Goodman, who run a plant-based health program with teaching and physical therapies down there. What's important about that is that they are Seventh-day Adventists. And we all know from the Blue Zone data that the only Blue Zone that has been identified within the United States is in Loma Linda, California, which is where a lot of white Seventh-day Adventists live. And in fact, according to Blue Zone data, the Seventh-day Adventists in Loma Linda are the longest lived population within the Blue Zone groups. And that is because they have the diet that is essentially entirely plant-based. Well, what Donna and Eddie made me aware of is, and what many people are not aware of, is that the reason Huntsville, Alabama is important is because there is a large group of Black Seventh-day Adventists and Black Seventh-day Adventists, vegetarians and vegans down there. And they were telling me that there's a second Blue Zone in the United States of Black Seventh-day Adventists who live well into their 90s and 100s, but it simply has not been identified. And so here again, we have the influence of unconscious racism that causes people to overlook communities and populations of color and miss important phenomena right in front of us that would help underscore not only how important and integral plant-based diets are within communities of color, but the benefits that are being reaped from these diets by these communities.
Wow, well said. So I just want to say, I want to thank all of you for being part of this discussion. There's so much here that we can build on. In crisis, there is opportunity. And I think that there is an opportunity to make the children of color in America a whole lot healthier, thanks to the incredible work of Dr. Milton Mills, thanks to the incredible work of Cynthia King, who educates hundreds of children every year in her community in Brooklyn about the benefits of a plant-based diet. And by the way, puts on an incredible show of her students doing incredible ballet. And you're all my heroes. Thank you, Lisa Karlan, for being a part of this. And I wish you all the very best. We will continue this conversation. In fact, we've got Dr. Milton Mills coming up in just a couple of days again. Thank you again. Thank you for joining.
My pleasure.
Share out, people.
All right.
Bye.